This past week, the DEA did something it tried and failed to do a decade ago. It moved to put a kratom-derived compound into Schedule 1, which is the same category as heroin. The last time the DEA tried to do this in 2016, it had to walk it back within 6 weeks due to a massive public backlash. So what's different this time? Quite a bit, actually. And the details matter because they tell you something real about how we regulate substances that live in this sort of gray zone between supplement, medicine, and addictive and potentially otherwise harmful substance. I'm Dr. Suzette Glasner. I'm a clinical psychologist and addiction scientist. And today I want to walk you through what just happened with 7-hydroxymetragenine, known as 7-OH, why the DEA is treating it differently than kratom itself, and what a decade of regulatory back and forth on this substance tells us about the limits of our current system for catching hazardous drugs before they cause harm. So let's just start with the basics, because the terminology here can get a little bit confusing fast, and the confusion is actually part of the story. So kratom comes from the leaves of an evergreen tree, Mitragina speciosa, a tree that's native to Southeast Asia. And I have a whole episode about kratom and what it is, and a separate episode about 7-OH. So if you're curious about this topic, definitely check those out. But just to recap, people have used kratom for a long time. It has mildly stimulating effects in lower doses and then sedative-like pain-relieving effects at higher doses. And increasingly in the United States, it is being used as sort of a supplement for self-management of pain. Some people use it to help them come off of other opioids, like painkillers. Some people use it for anxiety or to boost their mood. So the leaf contains dozens of compounds, but the one that matters the most here is known as metragenine, and that's the primary active alkaloid. Now, then we have 7-OH, which is in its full title, 7-hydroxymetragenine. This is a minor compound that occurs naturally in the kratom leaf, but only in trace amounts. So your body actually converts a little bit of metragenine into 7-OH when you metabolize it. Now, in the raw leaf, this is a relatively minor player, but the problem is what's happened to 7-OH outside of the leaf, which is that over the past several years, manufacturers have figured out how to extract and concentrate 7-OH or synthesize related compounds entirely, and then they put them into very attractive, highly marketable formulations like tablets, gummies, drink shots, liquid extracts. And what makes it extra confusing is that they will market them as kratom products, even though they're not the same as leaf kratom. These products can contain 7-OH at levels that's far beyond anything you get from chewing on an actual leaf. And that distinction, 7-OH in leaf kratom in these relatively small quantities versus concentrated or synthetic 7-OH in manufactured products, is really the entire crux of this recent news from the DEA. So let's talk a little bit about what the research actually shows about 7-OH and why regulators are treating it as an opioid. So 7-OH is a high affinity partial agonist. It acts on the mu opioid receptor. So we have these naturally occurring receptors in our brains that act sort of as receivers for opioids. And that's where 7-OH acts in the brain, on these receivers, or what we would call opioid receptors. So that's the same receptor that's targeted by other opioid painkillers like morphine, oxycodone, and even fentanyl. So lab studies have found that it is far more potent than metragenine at that receptor, and more potent in some studies than morphine itself. It also produces some of the side effects or adverse effects that can lead to an overdose fatality. So it produces respiratory depression. So it's like slowing down your respiratory system, which in its most extreme form could be to stop breathing, which would then lead to death. And in humans, we now have case reports of opioid-like withdrawal syndromes among people who use 7-OH. We also have that with kratom, but in the case of 7-OH, we see case reports of opioid-like withdrawal, tolerance, diagnosable, what we call kratom use disorder, hospitalizations, and fatalities that are tied specifically to 7-OH products. We have also seen fatalities in relation to kratom products. So the potential hazards of kratom are not off the table, but certainly at these highly concentrated levels of 7-OH, the 7-OH products that synthesize and concentrate that particular element of the kratom leaf is known to be quite dangerous and is eliciting far more concern at this moment from a regulatory standpoint than the kratom leaf itself. So when public health officials describe 7-OH as an emerging opioid threat, that's a fairly accurate description of their pharmacology when we're talking about 7-OH. Now, let's talk a little bit about the history and why the DEA tried this once before and it didn't work so well. And this is where the story gets interesting from a policy standpoint, because we've actually run this experiment before. Back in August of 2016, the DEA announced its intent to temporarily ban both mitragynine and 7-OH, placing them on Schedule 1, essentially banning them outright, leaf and all. The agency cited poison control data as being sort of behind this action, about 660 kratom-related calls over 5 years. And within weeks, the DEA was flooded with public comment from people who use kratom, who said it helped them to manage their chronic pain or stay off of opioids, from researchers who argued that the pharmacology didn't support this Scheduled 1 designation, and even from members of Congress who opposed this action. By October 2016, less than 2 months later, the DEA withdrew the notice entirely. That withdrawal created an entire decade of this regulatory kind of limbo. And the FDA has issued alerts and repeated public warnings about kratom's opioid-like effects, but there's been no federal scheduling. So what's happened is at the state level, there have been these sort of uneven ways of trying to fill that gap or address concerns about potential toxicity and dangers associated with both kratom and 7-OH. Now, what gets really kind of confusing is that state by state, there have been various approaches to trying to address the potential toxicity and hazards associated with any form of kratom or a kratom derivative, whether it's the kratom leaf or 7-OH. And some states have just outright banned kratom, and others have tried to take a little bit more of a tempered approach to it, informed by what's known as the Kratom Consumer Protection Act, by forming laws that regulate the purity, labeling, and age restrictions around who can use kratom or purchase kratom, rather than banning the leaf entirely. And a few states have just gone back and forth. So it's genuinely a very fractured kind of patchwork. And as state by state this has been hashed out and debated, the concentrated 7-OH product category just continued to grow, largely unregulated for years. So now you are seeing 7-OH products sitting on gas station shelves completely unregulated, and you have no idea really what you're getting when you purchase one of these in terms of the potency, the toxicity, the addiction potential, the dangers, because they're simply not labeled and there's very little information to guide safe potential consumption. Now, there really isn't any definitive evidence that the Kratom Consumer Protection Act has been effective in preventing overdoses. So while data are still emerging, recent public health studies indicate that states relying solely on the Kratom Consumer Protection Act or having no regulations generally are seeing worse health outcomes, as you might imagine, than states that have instituted bans or more restrictive types of measures. The FDA started taking a little bit more of a direct aim at 7-OH specifically. In July of 2025, the FDA issued warning letters to several companies marketing 7-OH tablets, gummies, drink mixes, and shots. And that same month, FDA formally recommended that DEA schedule concentrated 7-OH products. So I just want to spend a moment talking about what scheduling means. We hear about that all the time, but it, is a little bit of a nuanced process. So the Controlled Substances Act sorts drugs into 5 schedules. They're numbered 1 through 5. And it's based on 3 things. The first is their abuse potential. How likely is this drug to become habit forming? Whether there's currently an accepted medical use for the drug in the United States, and how safe the substance is even under medical supervision. So Schedule 1 is the most restrictive tier. This means that the drug is considered to have very high potential to be misused or to be habit forming or to produce addiction. No accepted medical use and no accepted safety profile, even with a doctor's oversight. So as an example, heroin falls under Schedule 1, LSD falls under Schedule 1. Practically speaking, a Schedule 1 listing makes the substance illegal to manufacture, distribute, or possess the substance outside of very narrow, tightly licensed research settings, which also makes it harder to do the clinical research that might otherwise settle exactly how dangerous or useful a substance is. Schedules 2 till 5 sort of ease up from there, allowing medical use with progressively fewer restrictions. So 5 would be the most unrestricted use of a substance. This most recent action from the DEA would place concentrated 7-OH above a to be determined threshold into that most restrictive Schedule 1 category, at least temporarily, and this would leave room to set the exact cutoff through public comment. So that's why I said a to be determined threshold. There's now a 30-day period for public comment to weigh in on what exactly the concentration threshold should be for 7-OH products to be in this most restrictive category. Now, in December of 2025, FDA, the Department of Justice, and the U.S. Marshals seized roughly $1 million of unlawful 7-OH products from 3 companies in Missouri. So this recent action wasn't a sudden move. It was really a culmination of about a year of building regulatory pressure, specifically targeting the concentrated products learned from really the failure of that blanket 2016 approach. So what actually happened? Here's what the DEA did precisely, because the details are also a bit more nuanced than the headline suggests. So on July 1st, the DEA issued 2 separate notices of intent. The first would temporarily schedule 7-OH itself, but only above a specific concentration threshold, not those trace amounts that are found naturally in the kratom leaf. The second would schedule 3 compounds that don't occur naturally in the plant at all: MP or mitragynine pseudoindoxyl, and 2 synthetic derivatives known as MGM-15 and MGM-16. These are lab-modified molecules that are being sold online in candies and in liquid shots, marketed deceptively as kratom extracts, even though what they really are is highly concentrated 7-OH products. The Department of Health and Human Services was explicit that this is not intended to capture natural leaf kratom. So there's now this 30-day public comment period where exactly that concentration threshold should be set. And by law, the Attorney General can't issue the actual temporary scheduling order to place it on Schedule 1 until at least 30 days after the notices were published. Once that happens, the scheduling will last for 2 years with the option to extend to a third. Now, interestingly, the American Kratom Association, which is the group that really helped kill the 2016 scheduling attempt, is supporting this one. And they have spent a decade arguing that concentrated engineered 7-OH products aren't the same thing as the botanical leaf, and that lumping them together does harm both to people who use the kratom leaf without the same risk profile and to public understanding of what's actually dangerous here. So I want to add a caveat to that, because the way that this has all been framed from a regulatory standpoint makes it sound like there's these two categories. There's safe kratom, which is the kratom leaf, and there's unsafe kratom or kratom-derived products, which is the 7-OH concentrates. And it's really not all that black and white according to what we understand from the research. So there was a 2024 survey that looked at over 2,000 self-identified kratom consumers and found that over a quarter of them met criteria for what would be known as a kratom use disorder. That's the same thing as a drug use disorder, an addiction to alcohol or another substance. It could be mild, moderate, or severe. And in most cases, it was mild to moderate, but about 14% were classified as severe. Severe means that you have more symptoms of the substance use disorder. So not only do you have tolerance or withdrawal to a substance, but it's also creating some problems with your health and with your life, and you're still finding yourself using it anyway. The odds of meeting criteria for a kratom use disorder were nearly triple among people who had prior substance use or a psychiatric history. So there are some people who are more vulnerable to developing a sort of loss of control over their use of kratom and kratom-related products. And that's a pattern that we do see across substances. So it's consistent with what we see with other substance use that can get out of control. The other limitation to our understanding of the potential harms associated with kratom leaf, as distinguished from 7-OH, is that there is really no research that tells us what proportion of people who start out using the leaf, which has those trace amounts of 7-OH and is generally considered less risky than 7-OH concentrates, what percentage of them go on to develop tolerance and these sort of dependency symptoms on the kratom leaf products and progress to using 7-OH and 7-OH products. Since we don't have an answer to that question, I would really caution against making a very black or white assumption that one set of products is safe and the other isn't. It's really more nuanced than that. And so what you really want to think about in being an informed consumer of any kratom related product is, how is it affecting you? So if you or someone you love is losing control over their use of any kratom product, whether it's considered leaf kratom or 7-OH, if they're struggling with tolerance, so they need to take more of it than they meant to or plan to in order to feel the same effects of it, whatever effect it is that they desire or they're looking for by taking this substance, or if they experience withdrawal symptoms when they stop taking it, that's worth taking seriously and talking to a healthcare provider about. And there are effective treatments for kratom use disorder. They are the same treatments that we use for addictions to other opioids. So that's the current status on the DEA actions of recent with regards to kratom. I'm really happy to see and encouraged to see that the regulatory bodies of the United States are taking a more active stance on protecting consumers from those 7-OH concentrates. I would like to see more research into the progression from kratom leaf products to 7-OH use in order to inform what kind of clinical recommendations we should be making out there to people who are taking these substances. I hope I've given you some more to think about if you or someone you care about is using them. I hope you learned something valuable today, and I look forward to seeing you next time.